my next guest. He is out of Washington State. He is, of course, former head of the Seattle King County NAACP. Carl Mack is an historian. Carl, your issues with Juneteenth. Your thoughts about this action today. What are the issues?
I think they're historically absolutely incorrect, and I think they're insulting to us as a people. And so
Who's incorrect?
Those who, the Congress, that bill passing was absolutely incorrect.
So what should it have been?
Okay, so the bill says, and what is being taught, and I'll just give you specifically in the state of Washington. And first of all, Roland, let me be clear. I have absolutely no problem with Juneteenth. My problem is the historical efforts that are being made and what's being surrounded. I call it the misrepresentation of Juneteenth. And so what happened in the state of Washington is they passed similar legislation, and this legislation has been passed a lot throughout this country. And in the state of Washington, similar to what they just did in Congress, they said that the legislature intends to designate Juneteenth as a statewide holiday celebrating the end of chattel slavery. So what people have been taught about Juneteenth is that those of our ancestors who was enslaved in Galveston, Texas, number one, they were the last blacks to be enslaved in this country. Number two, that they got the word a year and a half late after President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Both of those things historically are just incorrect. There is no other way to put it. Now, all one has to do is to understand.
At 7 p.m. today, the Urgent Debt Relief Initiative will end. Under this program,
slavery ended in this country on December 6th, 1865, 6 months after Juneteenth. Now, going back to the Emancipation Proclamation, which everybody seems to get so twisted, keep in mind what Lincoln said. Lincoln said, for those states in rebellion against the Union, and there were 11 of them, but in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln only mentioned 10 of them. And the only reason he only mentioned 10 is because the 11th state that he didn't mention was Tennessee. He didn't mention them because the Union already had control of Tennessee. So he said, for those states in rebellion against the Union, slavery is now over. Now, keep in mind, there were 4 border states in which slavery was still practiced. Those border states were Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, Kentucky, and Delaware. So when Lincoln said that to him, I want you to imagine this, and you don't have to imagine, this is just a fact. When those 11 states left the Union, they didn't act as 11 individual states. They formed a confederacy. And when they formed a confederacy, in effect, they formed their own nation, which means they elected a president, Jefferson Davis. They elected a vice president, Alexander Stephens of Georgia. They wrote a Confederate Constitution. They were their own nation, Brother Roland. So when Lincoln issued, quote unquote, an executive order trying to tell them what to do, that's like the Prime Minister of Canada trying to tell the United States citizens what to do. He didn't have any authorization. That's why it took a war. So that's why I'm saying to you that when the news is that they got the word a year and a half late, it didn't matter. The Confederacy were their own nation. They didn't give a damn what the United States said, what Lincoln said. That's why it took the war. Now, as far as them being the last blacks enslaved, I just heard your last guest. I've heard all of you say how important it is to get it right. Today, there's a movement that has swept this country that we should all be proud of, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Do we think that Black lives just started mattering? Because let's go back to what happened with the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln said that in those states not in rebellion against the Union, slavery is still legal. Keep that going. 2 of those states were Delaware and Kentucky. 2 of them was Maryland and Missouri. And keep in mind, West Virginia wasn't a state when the Civil War started. It became a state after Virginia seceded. And those 48 counties didn't want to secede, so they became a state after the Civil War. So now let's look at those 5 border states. Maryland, on November 1st, 1864, before the Civil War ended, Maryland abolished slavery. Missouri, on January 11, 1865, before the Civil War ended, they abolished slavery. West Virginia, the newly entered slave state, on February 3rd, 1865, ended slavery. The Civil War ends on April 9th, 1865. 2 months later, Granger rides into Galveston, Texas, and issues General Order Number 3, which we now call June 19th. I ask you to remember what was going on in Kentucky and Delaware after the Civil War. What was going on in Kentucky and Delaware after Juneteenth? I'll tell you, Roland, there were 225,000 of our ancestors still enslaved, and they did not taste freedom until December 6, 1865, when Georgia became the 27th state to ratify the 13th Amendment. That is my problem with what is going on in states all across this country, and that is my problem about what just happened in the United States Congress. If you want to designate a date in which all Black folks can celebrate freedom, that date, as far as I'm concerned, as far as history appears to be concerned, is December 6th, because that is the day in which Georgia ratified the 13th Amendment. Now, as it applies to Delaware and Kentucky, keep this in mind, Roland. Delaware didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1901. Kentucky ratified the 13th Amendment in 1976. And the state that I'm from, Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until February 7, 2013. So, do I have a problem with Juneteenth? Absolutely not. Do I have a problem with the historical inaccuracy of it? Every part of that I got a problem with.
And that has been, first of all, it's like for years, Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, again, and those